Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. We left Cecilia having listened really to a long debate on independence versus conformity. It got rather philosophical for chapter 2 of a novel, did it not? Hopefully you will find that the next chapter requires, shall we say, less intelligence to understand it. Chapter 3, An Arrival. As soon as they lost sight of the house, Cecilia expressed her surprise at the behaviour of the old gentleman who sat in the corner, whose general silence, seclusion from the company, and absence of mind had strongly excited her curiosity. Mr. Harrel could give her very little satisfaction. He told her that he had twice or thrice met him in public places, where everybody remarked the singularity of his manners and appearance, but that he had never discoursed with any one to whom he seemed known, and that he was as much surprised as herself in seeing so strange a character at the house of Mr. Monckton. The conversation then turned upon the family they had just quitted, and Cecilia warmly declared the good opinion she had of Mr. Monckton, the obligation she owed to him for the interest which from her childhood he had always taken in her affairs, and her hopes of reaping much instruction from the friendship of a man who had so extensive a knowledge of the world. Mr. Harrel professed himself well satisfied that she should have such a counsellor, for though but little acquainted with him, he knew he was a man of fortune and fashion, and well esteemed in the world. They mutually compassionated his unhappy situation in domestic life, and Cecilia innocently expressed her concern at the dislike Lady Margaret seemed to have taken of her, a dislike which Mr. Harrel naturally enough imputed to her youth and beauty, yet without suspecting any cause more cogent than a general jealousy of attractions of which she had herself so long outlived the possession. As their journey drew near its conclusion, all the uneasy and disagreeable sensations which in the bosom of Cecilia had accompanied its commencement gave way to the expectation of quick approaching happiness in again meeting her favourite young friend. Mrs. Harrel had in childhood been her playmate, and in youth her schoolfellow. A similarity of disposition with respect to sweetness of temper had early rendered them dear to each other, though the resemblance extended no further, Mrs. Harrel having no pretensions to the wit or understanding of her friend, but she was amiable and obliging, and therefore sufficiently deserving affection, though neither blazing with attractions which lay claim to admiration, nor endowed with those superior qualities which mingle respect in the love they inspire. From the time of her marriage, which was near 3 years, she had entirely quitted Suffolk, and had had no intercourse with Cecilia but by letter. She was now just returned from Violet Bank, the name given by Mr. Harrel to a villa about 12 miles from London, where with a large party of company she had spent the Christmas holidays. Their meeting was tender and affectionate. The sensibility of Cecilia's heart flowed from her eyes, and the gladness of Mrs. Harrel's dimpled her cheeks. As soon as their mutual salutations, expressions of kindness, and general inquiries had been made, Mrs. Harrel begged to lead her to the drawing-room, where, she added, you will see some of my friends, who are impatient to be presented to you. I could have wished, said Cecilia, after so long an absence, to have passed this first evening alone with you. They are all people who particularly desired to see you, she answered, and I had them by way of entertaining you, as I was afraid you would be out of spirits at leaving Bury. Cecilia, finding the kindness of her intentions, forbore any further expostulation, and quietly followed her to the drawing-room. But as the door was opened, she was struck with amazement upon finding that the apartment, which was spacious, lighted with brilliancy, and decorated with magnificence, was more than half filled with company, every one of which was dressed with gaiety and profusion. Cecilia, who from the word friends expected to have seen a small and private party, selected for the purpose of social converse, started involuntarily at the sight before her, and had hardly courage to proceed. Mrs. Harrel, however, took her hand and introduced her to the whole company, who were all severally named to her, a ceremonial which, though not merely agreeable, but even necessary to those who live in the gay world, in order to obviate distressing mistakes or unfortunate implications in discourse, would by Cecilia have been willingly dispensed with, since to her their names were as new as their persons, and since, knowing nothing of their histories, parties, or connections, she could to nothing allude. It therefore served but to heighten her colour and increase her embarrassment. A native dignity of mind, however, which had early taught her to distinguish modesty from bashfulness, enabled her in a short time to conquer her surprise and recover her composure. She entreated Mrs. Howell to apologize for her appearance, and being seated between two young ladies, endeavoured to seem reconciled to it herself. Nor was this very difficult, for while her dress, which she had not changed since her journey, joined to the novelty of her face, attracted general observation, the report of her fortune, which had preceded her entrance, secured to her general respect. She soon found, too, that a company was not necessarily formidable because full dressed, that familiarity could be united with magnificence, and that though to her every one seemed attired to walk in a procession or to grace a drawing-room, no formality was assumed, and no solemnity was affected. Every one was without restraint, even rank obtained but little distinction. Ease was the general plan, and entertainment the general pursuit. Cecilia, though new to London, which city the ill health of her uncle had hitherto prevented her seeing, was yet no stranger to company. She had passed her time in retirement, but not in obscurity, since for some years past she had presided at the table of the Dean, who was visited by the first people of the county in which he lived, and notwithstanding his parties, which were frequent, though small and elegant, though private, had not prepared her for the splendour or the diversity of a London assembly, yet they, by initiating her in the practical rules of good breeding, had taught her to subdue the timid fears of total inexperience, and to repress the bashful feelings of shamefaced awkwardness, fears and feelings which rather call for compassion than admiration, and which, except in extreme youth, serve but to degrade the modesty they indicate. She regarded, therefore, the two young ladies between whom she was seated, rather with a wish of addressing than a shyness of being attacked by them. But the elder, Miss Larolles, was earnestly engaged in discourse with the gentleman, and the younger, Miss Leeson, totally discouraged her by the invariable silence and gravity with which from time to time she met her eyes. Uninterrupted, therefore, except by occasional speeches from Mr. and Mrs. Howell, she spent the first part of the evening merely in surveying the company. Nor was the company dilatory in returning her notice, since from the time of her entrance into the room she had been the object of general regard. The ladies took an exact inventory of her dress, and internally settled how differently they would have been attired if blessed with equal affluence. The men disputed amongst themselves whether or not she was painted, and one of them offering boldly that she rouged well, a debate ensued, which ended in a bet, and the decision was mutually agreed to depend upon the colour of her cheeks by the beginning of April, when, if unfaded by bad hours and continual dissipation, they wore the same bright bloom with which they were now glowing, her champion acknowledged that his wager would be lost. In about half an hour the gentleman with whom Miss Larolles had been talking left the room, and then that young lady, turning suddenly to Cecilia, exclaimed, "How odd Mr. Meadows is! Do you know, he says he shan't be well enough to go to Lady Nyland's assembly. How ridiculous! As if that could hurt him!" Cecilia, surprised at an attack so little ceremonious, lent her a civil but silent attention. "You shall be there, shan't you?" she added. "No, ma'am, I have not the honour of being at all known to her ladyship." "Oh, there's nothing in that," returned she, "for Mrs. Howell can acquaint her you are here, and then, you know, she'll send you a ticket, and then you can go." "A ticket?" repeated Miss Cecilia. "Does Lady Nyland only admit her company with tickets?" "Oh, Lord!" cried Miss Larolles, laughing immoderately. "Don't you know what I mean? Why, a ticket is only a visiting card with a name upon it, but we all call them tickets now." Cecilia thanked her for the information, and then Miss Larolles inquired how many miles she had travelled since morning. 73, answered Cecilia, "which I hope will plead my apology for being so little dressed." "Oh, you're vastly well," returned the other, "and for my part I never think about dress. But only conceive what happened to me last year. Do you know, I came to town the 20th of March. Was not that horrid provoking?" "Perhaps so," said Cecilia, "but I'm sure I cannot tell why." "Not tell why?" repeated Miss Larolles. "Why, don't you know it's the very night of the grand private masquerade at Lord Darrian's? I would not have missed it for the whole universe. I never travelled in such an agony in my life. We did not get till town till monstrous late, and then, do you know, I had neither a ticket nor a habit. Only conceive what distress! I sent to every creature I knew for a ticket, but they all said there was not one to be had. So I was just like a mad creature. But about 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, a young lady of my particular acquaintance, by the greatest good luck in the world, happened to be taken suddenly ill. So she sent me her ticket. Was not that delightful?" "For her, extremely," said Cecilia, laughing. "Well," she continued, "then I was almost out of my wits with joy, and I went about and got one of the sweetest dresses you ever saw. If you'll call upon me some morning, I'll show it you." Cecilia, not prepared for an invitation so abrupt, bowed without speaking, and Miss Larolles, too happy in talking herself to be offended at the silence of another, continued her narration. "Well, but now comes the vilest part of the business. Do you know, when everything else was ready, I could not get my hairdresser. I sent all over the town. He was nowhere to be found. I thought I should have died with vexation. I assure you I cried, so that if I had not gone in a mask, I should have been ashamed to be seen. And so, after all this monstrous fatigue, I was forced to have my hair dressed by my own maid, quite in a common way. Was it not cruelly mortifying?" "Well, yes," answered Cecilia. "I should think it was almost sufficient to make you regret the illness of the young lady who sent you her ticket." They were now interrupted by Mrs Harrel, who advanced to them, followed by a young man of a serious aspect and modest demeanour, and said, "I am happy to see you both so well engaged, but my brother has been reproaching me with presenting everybody to Miss Beverley but himself." "I cannot hope," said Mr Arnott, "that I have any place in the recollection of Miss Beverley, but long as I have been absent from Suffolk, and unfortunate as I was in not seeing her during my last visit there, I am yet sure, even at this distance of time, grown and formed as she is, I should instantly have known her." "Amazing!" cried an elderly gentleman in a tone of irony, who was standing near them, "for the face is a very common one." "I remember well," said Cecilia, "that when you left Suffolk I thought I had lost my best friend." "Is that possible?" cried Mr Arnott, with a look of much delight. "Yes, indeed, and not without reason, for in all disputes you were my advocate, in all plays my companion, and in all difficulties my assistant." "Madam," cried the same gentleman, "if you liked him because he was your advocate, companion, and assistant, pray like me too, for I am ready to become all three at once." "You are very good," said Cecilia, laughing, "but at present I find no want of any defender." "That's a pity," he returned, "for Mr Arnott seems to me very willing to act the same parts over again with you." "But for that purpose he must return to the days of his childhood." "Ah, would to heaven it were possible!" cried Mr Arnott, "for they were the happiest of my life." "After such a confession," said his companion, "surely you will let him attempt to renew them. 'Tis but taking a walk backwards, and though it is very early in life for Mr Arnott to sigh for that retrograde motion, which in the regular course of things we shall all in our turns desire, yet with such a motive as recovering Miss Beverley for a playfellow, who can wonder that he anticipates the youth in the hopeless wishes of age?" Here Miss Larolles, who was one of that numerous tribe of young ladies to whom all conversation is irksome in which they are not themselves engaged, quitted her place, of which Mr Gosport, Cecilia's new acquaintance, immediately took possession. "Is it utterly impossible," continued this gentleman, "that I should assist in procuring Mr Arnott such a renovation? Is there no subaltern part I can perform to facilitate the project? For I will either hide or seek with any boy in the parish, and for Q in the corner there is none more celebrated." "I have no doubt, sir," answered Cecilia, "of your accomplishments, and I should be not a little entertained with the surprise of the company, if you could persuade yourself to display them." "And what," cried he, "could the company do half so well as to arise also and join in the sport? It would but interrupt some tale of scandal, or some description of a toupee. Active wit, however despicable when compared with intellectual, is yet surely better than the insignificant click-clack of modish conversation," casting his eyes towards Miss Larolles, "or even the pensive dullness of affected silence," changing their direction towards Miss Leeson. Cecilia, though surprised at an attack upon the society her friend had selected, by one who was admitted to make a part of it, felt its justice too strongly to be offended at its severity. "I have often wished," he continued, that when large parties are collected, as here, without any possible reason why they might not as well be separated, something could be proposed in which each person might innocently take a share. For surely after the first half-hour they could find little new to observe in the dress of their neighbours, or to display in their own, and with whatever seeming gaiety they may contrive to fill up the middle and end of the evening, by wire-drawing the comments afforded by the beginning, yea, are yet so miserably fatigued, that if they have not 4 or 5 places to run to every night, they suffer nearly as much from weariness of their friends in company, as they would do from weariness of themselves in solitude. Here, by the general breaking up of the party, the conversation was interrupted, and Mr. Gosport was obliged to make his exit, not much to the regret of Cecilia, who was impatient to be alone with Mrs. Harrel. The rest of the evening, therefore, was spent much more to her satisfaction. It was devoted to friendship, to mutual inquiries, to kind congratulations, and endearing recollections, and though it was late when she retired with reluctance. Now it's only 15 minutes in. Shall I read another chapter? Is it very long? No, not very long, and I think we need some more of Miss Larolles. So here we go. Chapter 4. A Sketch of High Life. Eager to renew a conversation which had afforded her so much pleasure, Cecilia, neither sensible of fatigue from her change of hours nor her journey, arose with the light, and as soon as she was dressed, hastened to the breakfast apartment. She had not, however, been more impatient to enter than she soon became to quit it, for though not much surprised to find herself there before her friend, her ardour for waiting her arrival was somewhat chilled, upon finding the fire but just lighted, the room cold, and the servants still employed in putting it in order. At 10 o'clock she made another attempt. The room was then better prepared for her reception, but still it was empty. Again she was retiring, when the appearance of Mr. Arnott stopped her. He expressed his surprise at her early rising, in a manner that marked the pleasure it gave to him, and then returning to the conversation of the preceding evening, he expatiated with warmth and feeling upon the happiness of his boyish days, remembered every circumstance belonging to the plays in which they had formerly been companions, and dwelt upon every incident with a minuteness of delight that showed his unwillingness ever to have done with the subject. This discourse detained her till they were joined by Mrs. Harrel, and then another, more gay and more general, succeeded to it. During their breakfast, Miss Larolles was announced as a visitor to Cecilia, to whom she immediately advanced with the intimacy of an old acquaintance, taking her hand and assuring her she could no longer defer the honour of waiting upon her. Cecilia, much amazed at this warmth of civility from one to whom she was almost a stranger, received her compliment rather coldly, but Miss Larolles, without consulting her looks or attending to her manner, proceeded to express the earnest desire she had long had to be known to her, to hope they should meet very often, to declare nothing could make her so happy, and to beg leave to recommend to her notice her own milliner. "I assure you," she continued, "she has all Paris in her disposal, the sweetest caps, the most beautiful trimmings, and her ribbons are quite divine. It is the most dangerous thing you can conceive to go near her. I never trust myself in her room, but I am sure to be ruined. If you please, I'll take you to her this morning." "If her acquaintance is so ruinous," said Cecilia, "I think I had better avoid it." "Oh, impossible! There's no such thing as living without her. To be sure, she's shocking dear, that I must own, but then who can wonder? She makes such sweet things, 'tis impossible to pay her too much for them." Mrs. Harrel now joining in the recommendation, the party was agreed upon, and accompanied by Mr. Arnott, the ladies proceeded to the house of the milliner. Here the raptures of Miss Larolles were again excited. She viewed the finery displayed with delight inexpressible, inquired who were the intended possessors, heard their names with envy, and sighed with all the bitterness of mortification that she was unable to order home almost everything she looked at. Having finished their business here, they proceeded to various other dress manufacturers, in whose praises Miss Larolles was almost equally eloquent, and to appropriate whose goods she was almost equally earnest. And then, after attending this loquacious young lady to her father's house, Mrs. Harrel and Cecilia returned to their own. Cecilia rejoiced at the separation, and congratulated herself that the rest of the day might be spent alone with her friend. "Why, no," said Mrs. Harrel, "not absolutely alone, for I expect some company tonight." "Company again tonight?" Nay, don't be frightened, for it will be a very small party, not more than 15 or 20 in all." "Is that so small a party?" said Cecilia, smiling. "And how short a time since would you, as well as I, have reckoned it a large one?" "Oh, you mean when I lived in the country," returned Mrs Harrel. "But what in the world could I know of parties or companies then?" "Not much indeed," said Cecilia, "as my present ignorance shows." The company of this evening were again all strangers to Cecilia, except Miss Leeson, who was seated next to her, and whose frigid looks again compelled her to observe the same silence she had so resolutely practised herself. Yet not the less was her internal surprise that a lady who seemed determined neither to give nor receive any entertainment should repeatedly choose to show herself in a company with no part of which she associated. Mr Arnott, who contrived to occupy the seat on her other side, suffered not the silence with which her fair neighbour had infected her to spread any further. He talked indeed upon no new subject, and upon the old one of their former sports and amusements he had already exhausted all that was worth being mentioned, but not yet had he exhausted the pleasure he received from the theme. It seemed always fresh and always enchanting to him. It employed his thoughts, regaled his imagination, and enlivened his discourse. Cecilia in vain endeavoured to change it for another. He quitted it only by compulsion, and returned to it with redoubled eagerness. When the company was retired, and Mr Arnott only remained with the ladies, Cecilia, with no little surprise, enquired for Mr Harrel, observing that she had not seen him the whole day. "Oh," cried his lady, "don't think of wondering at that, for it happens continually. He dines at home, indeed, in general, but otherwise I should see nothing of him at all." "Indeed? Why, how does he fill up his time?" "That I am sure I cannot tell, for he never consults me about it, but I suppose much in the same way that other people do." "Ah, Priscilla," cried Cecilia with some earnestness, "how little did I ever expect to see you so much a fine lady." "A fine lady!" repeated Mrs Harrel. "Why, what is it that I do? Don't I live exactly like everybody else that mixes at all with the world?" "You, Miss Beverley," said Mr Arnott in a low voice, "will, I hope, give to the world an example, not take one from it." Soon after they separated for the night. The next morning Cecilia took care to fill up her time more advantageously than in wandering about the house in search of a companion she now expected not to find. She got together her books, arranged them to her fancy, and secured to herself for the future occupations of her leisure hours the exhaustless fund of entertainment which reading, that highest, richest, and noblest source of intellectual enjoyment, perpetually affords. While they were yet at breakfast, they were again visited by Miss Larolles. "I am come," cried she eagerly, "to run away with you both to my Lord Belgrade's sale. All the world will be there, and we shall go in with tickets, and you have no notion how it will be crowded." "What is to be sold there?" said Cecilia. "Oh, everything you can conceive, house, stables, china, laces, horses, caps, everything in the world." "And do you intend to buy anything?" "Lord, no, but one likes to see the people's things." Cecilia then begged they would excuse her attendance. "Oh, by no means," cried Miss Larolles. "You must go, I assure you. There'll be such a monstrous crowd as you never saw in your life. I dare say we shall be half squeezed to death." "That," said Cecilia, "is an inducement which you must not expect will have much weight with a poor rustic just out of the country. It must require all the polish of a long residence in the metropolis to make it attractive." "Oh, but do go, for I assure you it will be the best sale we shall have this season. I can't imagine, Mrs Harrel, what poor Lady Belgrade will do with herself. I hear the creditors have ceased everything. I really believe creditors are the cruellest set of people in the world. They have taken these beautiful buckles out of her shoes. Poor soul, I declare it will make my heart ache to see them put up. It's quite shocking, upon my word. I wonder who will buy them. I assure you they were the prettiest fancies I ever saw. But come, if we don't go directly, there'll be no getting in." Cecilia again desired to be excused accompanying them, adding that she wished to spend the day at home. "At home, my dear?" cried Mrs Harrel. "Why, we have been engaged to Mrs Mears this month, and she begged me to prevail with you to be of the party. I expect she'll call or send you a ticket every moment." "How unlucky for me," said Cecilia, "that you should happen to have so many engagements just at this time. I hope at least there will not be any for tomorrow." "Oh yes, tomorrow we go to Mrs Elton's." Again, tomorrow. And how long is this to last? Oh, heaven knows. I'll show you my catalogue. She then produced a book which contained a list of engagements for more than 3 weeks. And as these, she said, are struck off, new ones are made, and so it is we go on till after the birthday. When this list had been examined and commented upon by Miss Larolles, and viewed and wondered at by Cecilia, it was restored to its place, and the two ladies went together to the auction, permitting Miss Cecilia, at her repeated request, to return to her own apartment. She returned, however, neither satisfied with the behaviour of her friend, nor pleased with her own situation. The sobriety of her education, as it had early instilled into her mind the pure dictates of religion and strict principles of honour, had also taught her to regard continual dissipation as an introduction to vice, and unbounded extravagance as the harbinger of injustice. Long accustomed to see Mrs Harrel in the same retirement in which she had hitherto lived herself, when books were their first amusement, and the society of each other was their chief happiness, the change she now perceived in her mind and manners equally concerned and surprised her. She found her insensible to friendship, indifferent to her husband, and negligent of all social felicity. Dress, company, parties of pleasure, and public places seemed not merely to occupy all her time, but to gratify all her wishes. Cecilia, in whose heart glowed the warmest affections and most generous virtue, was cruelly depressed and mortified by this disappointment. Yet she had the good sense to determine against upbraiding her, well aware that if reproach has any power over indifference, it is only that of changing it into aversion. Mrs Harrel, in truth, was innocent of heart, though dissipated in life. Married very young, she had made an immediate transition from living in a private family in a country town, to becoming mistress of one of the most elegant houses of Portman Square, at the head of a splendid fortune, and wife to a man whose own pursuits soon showed her the little value he himself set upon domestic happiness. Immersed in the fashionable round of company and diversions, her understanding naturally weak was easily dazzled by the brilliancy of her situation. Greedily, therefore, sucking in air impregnated with luxury and extravagance, she had soon no pleasure but to vie with some rival in elegance, and no ambition but to exceed some superior in expense. The Dean of wherever, in naming Mr Harrel for one of the guardians of his niece, had no other view than that of indulging her wishes by allowing her to reside in the house of her friend. He had little personal knowledge of him, but was satisfied with the nomination, because acquainted with his family, fortune, and connections, all which persuaded him to believe without further inquiry that it was more peculiarly proper for his niece than any other he could make. In his choice of the other two trustees he had been more prudent. The first of these, the Honourable Mr Delvile, was a man of high birth and character. The second, Mr Briggs, had spent his whole life in business, in which he had already amassed an immense fortune, and had still no greater pleasure than that of increasing it. From the high honour, therefore, of Mr Delvile, he expected the most scrupulous watchfulness that his niece should in nothing be injured, and from the experience of Mr Briggs in money matters, and his diligence in transacting business, he hoped for the most vigilant observance that her fortune, while under his care, should be turned to the best account. And thus, as far as he was able, he had equally consulted her pleasure, her security, and her pecuniary advantage. Mrs Harrel returned home only in time to dress for the rest of the day. When Cecilia was summoned to dinner, she found, besides her host and hostess and Mr Arnott, a gentleman she had not before seen, but who, as soon as she entered the parlour, Mr Harrel presented to her, saying at the same time he was one of the most intimate of his friends. This gentleman, Sir Robert Floyer, was about 30 years of age. His face was neither remarkable for its beauty nor its ugliness, but sufficiently distinguished by its expression of invincible assurance. His person, too, though neither striking for its grace nor its deformity, attracted notice from the insolence of his deportment. His manners, haughty and supercilious, marked the high opinion he cherished of his own importance, and his air and address, at once bold and negligent, announced his happy perfection in the character at which he aimed, that of an accomplished man of the town. The moment Cecilia appeared, she became an object of his attention, though neither with the look of admiration due to her beauty, nor yet with that of curiosity excited by her novelty, but with the scrutinizing observation of a man on the point of making a bargain, who views with fault-seeking eyes the property he means to cheapen. Cecilia, wholly unused to such an examination, so little ceremonious, shrunk abashed from his regards. But his conversation was not less displeasing to her than his looks. His principal subjects, which were horse racing, losses at play, and disputes at gaming tables, could afford her but little amusement, because she could not understand them. And the episodes with which they were occasionally interspersed, consisting chiefly of comparative strictures upon celebrated beauties, hints of impending bankruptcies, and witticisms upon recent divorces, were yet more disagreeable to her, because more intelligible. Wearied, therefore, with uninteresting anecdotes, and offended with injudicious subjects of pleasantry, she waited with impatience for the moment of retiring. But Mrs. Harrel, less eager because better entertained, was in no haste to remove, and therefore she was compelled to remain quiet till they were both obliged to rise, in order to fulfil their engagement with Mrs. Mears. As they went together to the house of that lady, in Mrs. Harrel's vis-a-vis, Cecilia, not doubting but their opinions concerning the baronet would accord, instantly and openly declared her disapprobation of everything he had uttered. But Mrs. Harrel, far from confirming her expectations, only said, "I am sorry you don't like him, for he is almost always with us." "Do you like him then yourself?" "Extremely. He is very entertaining and clever, and knows the world." "How judiciously do you praise him!" cried Cecilia. "And how long might you deliberate before you could add another word to his panegyric?" Mrs. Harrel, satisfied to commend, without even attempting to vindicate him, was soon content to change the subject; and Cecilia, though much concerned that the husband of her friend had made so disgraceful an election of a favourite, yet hoped that the lenity of Mrs. Harrel resulted from her desire to excuse his choice, not from her own approbation. Well, I hope you will agree that things are getting rather interesting. Cecilia is, you notice she's always laughing, she's always smiling, and that's attractive. The things she says, she doesn't always speak often, especially compared to the voluble Miss Larolles, who might remind you of a character in Austen. I should be interested to see if your thoughts run along the same lines as mine. But whenever she speaks, you can read it perfectly seriously, and yet there's often a sting in the tale for anyone intelligent enough to notice it, which I fancy that nobody that she has been speaking to in these 2 chapters is. Anyway, there we have it. Cecilia's situation is an interesting one. You will notice as well that her other 2 guardians are being set up as the competing views of family and decorum in Mr. Delvile, and money and commerce in Mr. Briggs, and that's going to play out a lot in the future. Anyway, thank you for listening, and because I haven't mentioned it since I started reading Cecilia, you can, of course, follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and links are in the box below this video, and please like and subscribe. Good evening!